In December 1941, America's Pacific War did not begin with victory. It began with retreat. As Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia, tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops were pushed into the jungles of the Philippines. Starving, sick, and outgunned. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the early war. A desperate last stand on the Bataan Peninsula. The fall of Corregidor. And a brutal march that shocked the world. This is the story of how the Philippines fell and why its loss reshaped the Pacific War. Before the war, the Philippines stood at the crossroads of empire. An American Commonwealth since 1898. The islands were both a symbol of U.S. influence in Asia and a strategic gateway between Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. For Japan, controlling the Philippines meant securing vital sea lanes and protecting the southern advance toward oil-rich territories, like the Dutch East Indies. For the United States, losing them would expose the entire Pacific. But despite the warnings, the islands were dangerously unprepared. American and Filipino forces lacked modern aircraft, tanks, and supplies. Defensive plans assumed reinforcements would arrive. Reinforcements that would never come. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, the clock in the Philippines began ticking. Just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck Clark Field, destroying much of America's air power on the ground. The invasion followed swiftly. Japanese troops landed across Luzon, overwhelming coastal defenses and forcing Allied commanders into a grim decision: abandon Manila and retreat. General Douglas MacArthur ordered his forces to fall back to the Bataan Peninsula, a rugged jungle stronghold meant to buy time. It was a strategy born of necessity, not confidence. Behind them, Manila was declared an open city. Ahead lay disease, hunger, and relentless enemy pressure. The Battle of Bataan had begun. On Bataan, the Allied army fought on borrowed time. Supplies ran out quickly. Food rations were slashed again and again. Men weakened from malaria and dysentery were sent back from the front. Despite everything, Filipino and American troops held the line for months, far longer than Japan expected. Each delay disrupted Japanese timetables across the Pacific. But the cost was catastrophic. Artillery shells were rationed. Medical supplies vanished. By April 1942, resistance was no longer possible. On April 9th, tens of thousands of exhausted troops surrendered. What followed would become infamous. The surrender at Bataan did not bring relief. It brought horror. Captured Allied troops were forced to march over 60 miles in brutal heat without food or water. Anyone who collapsed was beaten or executed. Civilians who tried to help were shot. Thousands died along the road. The Bataan Death March became one of the most notorious war crimes of the Pacific War. A symbol of the cruelty prisoners would face for years to come. For those who survived, imprisonment was only the beginning. Even after Bataan fell, one fortress still held: Corregidor, a rocky island guarding Manila Bay, had been nicknamed the Gibraltar of the East. From tunnels carved into stone, American and Filipino defenders endured constant bombardment. Food ran out. Water became contaminated. The wounded piled up underground. In May 1942, Japanese forces launched their final assault. Outnumbered and cut off, Corregidor surrendered on May 6th. The Philippines were now firmly in Japanese hands. For the United States, it was the largest surrender in its military history. Before Corregidor fell, General MacArthur had already escaped to Australia, famously vowing, "I shall return." His departure became a symbol of both humiliation and determination. Japan now turned its attention west, toward Burma, India, and China. The fall of the Philippines opened the door to the Burma campaign, threatening Allied supply lines and expanding the war deep into Southeast Asia. What began as a rapid conquest was becoming something larger and far more dangerous. The fall of the Philippines was a devastating blow, but it was not meaningless. Every day Bataan held slowed Japan's advance. Every sacrifice exposed the realities of the Pacific War. The suffering endured there hardened Allied resolve. And when MacArthur returned in 1944, the memory of Bataan and Corregidor shaped everything that followed. The Philippines had fallen, but the war for the Pacific was only What if the most decisive naval battle of World War II was won before a single shot was fired? In June of 1942, Japan brought 4 aircraft carriers to destroy the U.S. Navy for good. But the Americans already knew where and when the attack would come. Not because they had more ships, not because they had better planes, because they had broken the code. This is the Battle of Midway, the ambush that turned the Pacific War. By early 1942, the Pacific War looked grim for the United States. Pearl Harbor had shattered the fleet. The Philippines were collapsing. Japan's empire was expanding faster than anyone thought possible. At the center of Japan's power were aircraft carriers, floating airfields that could strike hundreds of miles away without warning. Japan believed that if it destroyed America's remaining carriers, the war in the Pacific would be over. The Midway Atoll became bait. A tiny outpost guarding the approaches to Hawaii. If Midway fell, Pearl Harbor would be exposed. And the U.S. Navy would be forced to fight on Japan's terms. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed one decisive battle could end the war. He was wrong. If you want to understand World War II as a connected story, not just isolated battles, subscribe to the channel. We're telling the war chronologically, episode by episode, using restored footage to show how it all fits together. What made Midway different wasn't firepower. It was intelligence. American code breakers had partially cracked Japan's naval code, known as JN-25. They couldn't read every message, but they could read enough. A mysterious objective kept appearing in Japanese communications. AF. U.S. intelligence suspected AF meant Midway. But suspicion wasn't enough to risk the fleet. So Midway sent an unencrypted radio message claiming its water system had failed. Soon after, Japanese communications reported that AF was short on fresh water. That single message confirmed everything. Japan was coming for Midway, and the Americans were ready. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States knew where the enemy would strike and when. Japan's plan for Midway was bold and dangerously complex. Its forces were divided across vast distances. Carrier groups would strike Midway, while diversionary fleets would draw American attention elsewhere. Battleships would follow behind to finish the job. Japanese commanders believed surprise was guaranteed. They assumed America's carriers were still reeling from earlier defeats and would take the bait. What they didn't know was that Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his carriers northeast of Midway. Hidden, silent, waiting. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown repaired from battle damage in just days. Japan expected to set the trap. Instead, it sailed straight into one. Before we get to the moment everything changes, this is a good time to subscribe. Battles like Midway only make sense when you see what came before and what comes next. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway. But the island wasn't neutralized. As Japan prepared a second strike, U.S. aircraft began arriving. Disorganized, unsupported, and outmatched. Torpedo squadrons flew low and slow, straight into a wall of fire. They were destroyed. Entire units vanished in minutes. On the surface, it looked like failure. But those attacks forced Japanese fighters to stay low. They kept carrier decks in constant motion. They prevented the Japanese from organizing a clean counterstrike. Unknowingly, those doomed crews were buying time. And above them, high in the clouds, American dive bombers were searching. Just after 10 a.m., everything changed. American dive bombers broke through the clouds. Below them were Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. Packed with fuel, bombs, and aircraft. Bombs slammed into the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Explosions tore through hangar decks. Fire spread uncontrollably. Three of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were destroyed almost simultaneously. Later that day, the final carrier, Hiryu, was found and destroyed as well. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, its most experienced pilots, and the offensive momentum of the Pacific War. Midway didn't end the war, but it changed its direction forever. It proved that modern wars could be decided by intelligence, timing, and decisions made long before the first bombs fell. This was the Battle of Midway. If this helped you understand why Midway mattered and how the war began to turn, consider subscribing. The story only gets more intense from here. Coming up next, Stalingrad, the battle that turned Hitler's invasion into a death trap and became the deadliest confrontation in human history. How did one man turn a military invasion into the deadliest battle in human history? In 1942, Hitler sent his armies into southern Russia and then refused to let them retreat. What followed wasn't strategy. It was starvation, freezing streets, and an entire army slowly disappearing. This is Stalingrad, where invasion became a death trap. By summer 1942, the war in the East was not going the way Hitler had promised. Operation Barbarossa had failed to destroy the Soviet Union. Moscow had held. Germany was now fighting a war of attrition it had never planned for. Hitler shifted his focus south. The Caucasus oil fields promised fuel for Germany's war machine. And along the Volga River stood a major industrial city, Stalingrad. The city controlled river traffic. It produced weapons. And it carried Stalin's name. To Hitler, taking Stalingrad was strategic and symbolic. To Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. From the beginning, Stalingrad was not a battle meant to be won quickly. It was meant to be endured. If you want World War II explained clearly, with real footage brought back to life in color, subscribe now. Every episode builds on the last, and this is where the war truly turns. In late summer 1942, German forces advanced toward Stalingrad with speed and confidence. The Luftwaffe bombed the city relentlessly. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Civilians were killed by the tens of thousands. From the air, it looked like victory. But the destruction created something Germany had not planned for. Rubble. German doctrine depended on movement. Tanks, coordination, combined arms. In Stalingrad, streets vanished. Buildings collapsed into defensive positions. The city became a maze of hellish ruins, with danger lurking in every crevice. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Street by street, room by room, sometimes floor by floor. What looked like progress on a map became a slow, grinding bleed. Time itself began to break down inside the city. German and Soviet units often operated on completely different schedules, sometimes fighting on opposite sides of the same building without realizing it. There were cases where soldiers slept through firefights, and others where men fought for days without knowing whether it was night or day. In Stalingrad, the front line wasn't a line at all. It was anywhere and everywhere. As German troops pushed deeper into the city, Stalin issued one of the most infamous orders of the war, Order 227. Not one step back. Retreat was forbidden. Units that fled could be shot. Blocking detachments stood behind the lines to enforce it. For Soviet soldiers, survival meant holding ground, even if it meant dying in place. Factories kept producing weapons while fighting raged inside them. Workers became soldiers overnight. Snipers hunted from shattered buildings. The Volga River became the city's lifeline. Reinforcements crossed under constant fire. Many never reached the shore. Those who did were told one thing: there is no land beyond the Volga. If this episode is changing how you see the Battle of Stalingrad, hit like so this story reaches more people, and subscribe to stay with us, because the worst is still ahead. By November 1942, the battle had consumed everything. German troops were exhausted. Supplies were stretched thin. Winter was closing in. Then the Red Army struck back. Soviet forces attacked the German flanks. Held not by elite units, but weaker Axis allies. The offensive was massive. Within days, the German 6th Army was surrounded. The trap had closed. Commanders requested permission to break out. Hitler refused. He ordered the army to hold its position. Supplies, he promised, would come by air. They never did. The airlift failed. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Stalingrad became a frozen pocket of starvation and despair. By January 1943, collapse was unavoidable. German positions shrank into isolated pockets. Wounded men lay untreated. Soldiers froze where they stood. As the situation collapsed, Hitler made one final, symbolic decision. He promoted General Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear. Paulus was expected to die, not give up. Instead, He surrendered the next day. Over 90,000 German soldiers were captured. Only a fraction would ever return home. The 6th Army, one of Germany's finest, was destroyed. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. It marked the moment the Eastern Front turned permanently against Hitler. From this point forward, Germany would retreat, and the Soviet Union would advance all the way to Berlin. Stalingrad was not just the deadliest battle in history. It was the beginning of the end. What if the fate of World War II turned? Not in a capital city, not on a French beach, but in the open desert of North Africa. In late 1942, Hitler's armies were still advancing. Japan ruled the Pacific, and the British Empire was fighting for survival. Then, at a narrow strip of desert called El Alamein, one battle stopped the Axis cold. This wasn't a daring gamble. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was a deliberate, grinding confrontation. And when it ended, the direction of the war had changed forever. This is El Alamein, where the desert finally turned against the Axis. By 1942, North Africa had become far more than a sideshow. Control of the region meant control of the Mediterranean and access to Middle Eastern oil, and a direct threat to the British Empire's lifeline. If Axis forces pushed east through Egypt, they could reach the Suez Canal, cutting Britain off from India, Australia, and much of its empire. At the center of this struggle stood two commanders. On one side, Erwin Rommel, Germany's most celebrated battlefield commander, the Desert Fox. On the other, Bernard Montgomery, Monty, newly appointed to lead Britain's 8th Army, with one clear mission: stop Rommel, and stop him here. El Alamein was not chosen by chance. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, the impassable Qattara Depression. For the first time in the Desert War, Rommel could not maneuver around his enemy. There would be no flanking this time, no escape route, only forward or back. If you've been following the North Africa campaign with us, this is the moment everything we've covered builds momentum. Please subscribe to watch the full story of World War II in color. Rommel arrived at El Alamein exhausted and vulnerable. His forces had pushed hundreds of miles across the desert, outrunning their supply lines. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was limited. Replacement tanks were few. British air and naval power dominated the Mediterranean, intercepting Axis supply convoys before they reached Africa. Rommel knew the situation was desperate, but retreat was politically impossible. Hitler demanded forward momentum. Battalion allies were already wavering. Any pullback risked collapse. So, Rommel dug in, stretching his defenses across minefields and fortified positions, hoping to hold until supplies arrived. They never came. Meanwhile, the British were preparing something very different. Montgomery refused to rush. A very British style of patience ruled the day. He stockpiled tanks. He amassed artillery. He trained his men relentlessly. And most importantly, he waited until he had overwhelming superiority. This would not be another desert gamble. It would be a planned confrontation. And hopefully, annihilation. On the night of October 23rd, 1942, the desert erupted. Over 1,000 British guns opened fire simultaneously. One of the largest artillery barrages of the war. The ground shook. The night sky lit up. This was Operation Lightfoot. British infantry advanced through Axis minefields, clearing paths for tanks to follow. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Minefields slowed the advance. Axis counterattacks slammed into British armor. Tanks burned across the desert floor. But unlike earlier desert battles, the British could absorb losses. Rommel could not. Every destroyed Axis tank was irreplaceable. Every lost vehicle weakened the line. For days, the battle ground on. Then, Montgomery shifted tactics. He launched a focused assault, concentrating force against a narrow section of Axis front. Rommel's defenses cracked. By early November, the outcome was becoming clear. Axis fuel reserves were nearly gone. Ammunition was running low. Rommel himself fell ill, briefly leaving command. When he returned, the situation was beyond saving. British armor punched through weakened positions. Axis units began to fall back, then collapsed. Rommel requested permission to withdraw. Hitler refused. The order was absolute. Hold at all costs. But reality intervened. Rommel disobeyed the order and pulled back, saving what remained of his army. It was the right military decision and a devastating strategic loss. For the first time in the war, a major Axis army had been decisively defeated by British forces. If you're finding this breakdown useful, please subscribe. It helps you ensure you don't miss the moments where the war truly turns. El Alamein was more than a battlefield victory. It shattered the myth of Axis invincibility in North Africa and in general. Within days, Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch, trapping Axis armies between two advancing fronts. By May 1943, Axis forces in Africa would surrender en masse. But the impact went far beyond the desert. Winston Churchill famously declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The statement was exaggerated, but the sentiment was real. El Alamein restored Allied confidence. It stabilized the Mediterranean, and it set the stage for invasions of Italy and Western Europe. From this point forward, the Axis would increasingly fight on the defensive. The desert had turned. El Alamein wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a test of endurance, preparation, and resolve. Rommel fought brilliantly, but ran out of resources. Montgomery fought cautiously, but fought to win. In the vast emptiness of the North African desert, World War II quietly changed direction. If you want to follow the war as it unfolds, battle by battle, decision by decision, subscribe to our channel. This is the place to do it.